My family called me a failure at the BBQ. Now my sister needs me to get her hired. That sentence played quietly in my mind as I stood near the buffet table, holding a paper plate of coleslaw I didn't ask for. My name is Renee Porter. I'm 38, and for the last 8 years, I've been the quiet outlier in a family of overachievers. The BBQ had always been my mother's way of showcasing the Porter legacy each summer, a casual outdoor event that somehow included printed menus and hand-drawn seating charts. The wine was organic, the napkins were monogrammed, and the judgment was subtle but deliberate. This year, the judgment landed right on my shoulders the moment Emily stepped into the yard in her pastel dress and bright smile, announcing her new job search like a victory speech. She hadn't even poured herself a drink before she declared, loudly enough for every aunt and cousin to hear, that she was interviewing with a company called Calix Insight. She spoke the name slowly, with that same smug tone she used when explaining international tax law to my grandfather. She said it was an impact-driven analytics firm doing really exciting nonprofit data work, and that the executive role she applied for aligned perfectly with her leadership experience. She paused for dramatic effect, eyes scanning the faces in the crowd like she was waiting for applause, and she got it. I didn't move. I just stood there beside the patio fountain, watching my family react like she'd been nominated for an award. My father clapped her on the back, already making comments about how Emily would elevate the company's strategy. My mother beamed with a quiet satisfaction that always appeared when Emily did something meaningful. A few cousins nodded with polite envy, probably Googling Calix on their phones. No one looked at me. I didn't expect them to. What none of them knew, what not even Emily knew, was that I'm the founder and CEO of Calix Insight. For 8 years, I've kept my professional world separate from my family life, not out of shame, but out of self-preservation. After years of being called aimless, unconventional, or worst of all, full of untapped potential, I decided to stop explaining myself and just get to work. When I left my last full-time job, a well-paying role at a global education platform where I was quietly passed over for a promotion I had trained someone else to receive, I took the payout and walked away. I started Calix in a shared co-working space with 3 rented chairs, 2 hand-me-down monitors, and one big idea. I didn't tell anyone, not because I wanted to prove a point, but because I had nothing left to explain. My success wasn't going to come from their approval. Calix Insight was never built for prestige. It was built to solve a real problem. Schools, nonprofits, and local government programs had data they didn't know how to use. They were drowning in spreadsheets, but starving for insight. I knew I could bridge that gap. What began as basic dashboards for local school boards is now a full-scale analytics platform used by over 120 organizations across 5 states. We analyze metrics that matter: student retention, food insecurity, access to digital tools, things that actually shape people's lives. But you won't see me giving TED Talks or posing for magazine covers. I still work out of the same brick building in downtown Seattle. The lobby still smells like printer ink and rain. My family assumes I freelance. They think I take on projects. I've never corrected them. Whenever my mother introduces me, she says I do digital stuff for charities and moves the conversation along before I can speak. I let her. It was easier than fighting to be heard in a room already full of noise. Until now. Now my sister, the golden child with the gold-plated resume, is interviewing for a role in my company, completely unaware that the person reviewing her application already knows every detail she's about to stretch. She doesn't know the panel will include my leadership team, who've built Calyx with me from the ground up. She doesn't know I'll be sitting across the table from her, watching her try to spin her narrative into something that fits a mission she's never believed in. And the part that keeps circling in my head, even as I stand in the corner of this carefully staged barbecue, is that she had the nerve to look at me earlier and say, "Renee, you should really think about applying there too. They might have entry-level roles in project coordination or IT support." She meant it as advice. I smiled like it didn't sting. But tomorrow morning, she'll walk into a boardroom with floor-to-ceiling glass and my name on the door. And for the first time in our lives, she won't be the one holding the pen. The night Emily announced her interview with Calyx, I barely slept, not out of panic, but because memory has a way of getting louder when the house gets quiet. I lay in bed listening to the soft click of the rain against the glass, thinking about the last time I sat across from my parents and told them I had quit something. Back then, it was my job at Langridge Consulting, a firm where I had spent 4 years streamlining education data systems for private clients who cared more about polish than purpose. I was burned out, undercredited, and quietly exhausted by a system that rewarded people for maintaining appearances rather than solving anything real. When I gave notice, I wasn't scared. I was tired of waiting for permission to build something better. But telling my parents was harder than the decision itself. I still remember how my mother blinked twice before setting her coffee down, lips tightening before she forced a smile that didn't quite land. She asked me what I would do in the meantime, as if quitting was a phase that needed to be filled with something productive until I came to my senses. My father didn't say much. He just turned the newspaper page and asked if I had a backup plan. When I explained the idea, an analytics platform designed specifically for nonprofits and school districts who couldn't afford overpriced tech but needed real insights, my mother nodded slowly. The way someone might respond to a child describing an imaginary friend. They didn't mock me, but they didn't take it seriously either. That kind of indifference cuts deeper than criticism. At least when someone criticizes you, they've acknowledged your existence. Silence implies irrelevance. Over the next few months, I stopped trying to explain what I was doing. When they asked how work was going, I gave them vague answers, keeping busy, I'd say, or just consulting on a few projects. I told myself I didn't need their validation, but deep down, I wanted them to believe I could build something that mattered, not because I craved applause, but because some part of me still carried the hope that they might one day look at me without quiet disappointment in their eyes. The early days of Calyx weren't glamorous. I worked from a co-working desk wedged between a podcast studio and a crypto startup that burned out in 6 months. I ran my first client presentation using a borrowed projector and a logo I designed on Canva. I ate leftover granola bars for lunch and coded until my vision blurred. But every small win felt like a private victory. When one school district agreed to pilot the dashboard, I stayed up all night debugging the attendance filters just to make sure it worked. I didn't post about it. I didn't even tell my friends. I just wanted the data to speak for itself. I never applied for grants with my last name. I used Porter only on paperwork that required it, and stuck to my middle name, Renee Ellis. In all professional spaces, I wanted the work to stand on its own, free from family comparison. My sister Emily was rising fast through a global consulting firm by then, speaking on diversity panels and publishing pieces in business journals about impact strategy. Every holiday, my parents mentioned her articles like they were family heirlooms. I smiled and nodded, even when I knew some of her numbers were inflated and some of her strategies were taken from templates I had quietly published under a Creative Commons license. That irony never escaped me. As Calyx began to grow, I made a conscious decision not to bridge the two worlds. My family asked less and less about my work, and I gave them less and less to work with. I stopped showing up to every birthday dinner, skipped Christmas once, and let the emotional gap stretch until it stopped hurting. My therapist once asked me what I wanted from them, and it took me 5 full minutes to realize I didn't know anymore. Maybe at one point, I just wanted to be heard. Now, 6 years later, the same sister who used to call my work tech charity stuff is sitting on an applicant list for a role that oversees our social equity partnerships. I've reviewed her resume 3 times. The titles are real, the achievements well polished, but the language doesn't match the work. She's applying for a role that demands humility, data literacy, and alignment with our mission. What she's offering is brand and surface, and I know that because I know her. I've sat across from her when she interrupted conversations to quote reports she barely read. I've watched her talk over community organizers at panels meant to amplify their voices. And now she's walking into Calyx, thinking it's just another brand she can wear. But this time, she'll be met with more than a company. She'll be met with me. The call came just after 8:30, right as I was rinsing my coffee mug and getting ready to review the morning reports. Her name lit up on my screen like an old book pulled from the back of a forgotten shelf. Still there, still familiar, but heavy with context. I let it ring once more than necessary before I answered, not out of pettiness, but to collect myself. I hadn't spoken to Emily one-on-one in nearly a year. She usually sent holiday texts through the family group chat, the kind filled with smiling emojis and zero warmth. She only ever reached out directly when she needed something. I knew this wasn't a social call. "Hey, Renee," she began, her voice upbeat but slightly strained, like she was trying to sound casual while balancing on heels that didn't fit. "I hope I'm not catching you at a weird time." I told her I was free, which wasn't entirely true. But I was curious. She cleared her throat before launching into her request, skipping over any preamble. "So, I have this interview coming up with a company called Calyx Insight. I think it's your kind of world. You know, data and education and whatever it is you're doing these days." There was a pause. I could almost hear her reaching for the right tone, something between friendly and condescending, the one she had perfected over years of being praised at my expense. "I know you've worked in tech, even if it's not at an executive level, so I figured you might have some thoughts. What do companies like this usually look for?" She said this the way someone might describe a flea market find. I didn't correct her. I didn't tell her she was talking to the founder. I just listened as she fumbled through a list of buzzwords, trying to sound competent while asking for advice she clearly didn't respect. I offered a few safe, professional answers. Be specific. Know the company's mission. Show curiosity, not just competence. She thanked me, then immediately pivoted back into her comfort zone, suggesting that if things didn't work out for me where I was, she might be able to put in a good word for an entry-level role once she settled into Calyx. I nodded silently as she talked about administrative pathways and IT support jobs, trying to ignore the irony of her offering me a foothold in a company I had built from the ground up. I hung up after 10 minutes, her voice still in my ear like a fading echo. I sat quietly for a while, staring out at the gray Seattle skyline, wondering how we'd arrived here. 2 sisters, raised under the same roof, trained to chase the same kind of success, and yet somehow we ended up on opposite sides of an invisible wall, She was still running on a track built by our parents, checking off the milestones they valued most. I had stepped off that track years ago, but I hadn't fully reckoned with the gap it created until now. That night, I pulled up her application again. I read every line, not as a sister, but as a CEO. Her experience was solid on paper. She had the education, the titles, the network. But the substance didn't match the surface. There were exaggerated claims about system design, inflated descriptions of leadership responsibilities, and a listed proficiency in tools I knew she hadn't touched since her early analyst days. She had built her resume the way she'd built her persona, flawless on the outside, fragile underneath. I didn't feel angry. I felt something closer to fatigue, because I knew the pressure she carried. I knew how heavy it was to be the successful daughter, the one who had to keep outperforming even when she no longer believed in the game. Still, none of that changed my responsibility. I couldn't ignore the inconsistency just because it came from someone with my last name. Calix was built on integrity, not appearances. If I made exceptions for family, everything I stood for would start to erode. As I closed her file, I felt a strange sense of calm. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about clarity. For once. There would be no hiding behind assumptions, no carefully controlled family narrative, just two people sitting across from each other, stripped of pretense. One of them would be evaluated, the other would decide. The morning of the interview, I arrived at the office earlier than usual, not out of nerves, but out of respect for what was about to happen. I took the elevator to the top floor, walked through the quiet hallway, past the rows of glass-walled conference rooms, and unlocked my office with a familiar rhythm. The sun hadn't reached full brightness yet, but the harbor outside was already waking up. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence ground me. In less than an hour, my sister would walk through those doors believing she was being evaluated by strangers, and I would be sitting across from her, not as the sister she once pitied, but as the CEO she didn't know she was speaking to on the phone just 2 nights ago. The interview panel had already been briefed. I made it clear I didn't want special treatment or dramatics, only fairness and professional focus. They knew who she was. They also knew how hard I had worked to build Calix into what it was. There was no room for bias, not even the kind rooted in personal history. Raj from engineering would lead the technical portion. Veronica from legal would handle regulatory strategy. Sophia from HR would assess leadership alignment. I would close the session, not as her sister, but as the person responsible for whether she could truly belong here. At exactly 9:55, I got a message from reception. Candidate has checked in, awaiting escort. I rose slowly, grabbed the folder with her resume, and walked out toward the lobby, through the glass. I saw her before she saw me. She was seated upright, navy suit crisp, resume clutched in one hand and phone in the other. When she finally looked up, our eyes met, and something shifted behind her expression. Her smile faltered, not from fear, but from confusion. She rose, still unsure what she was looking at. "Miss Porter," I said calmly, extending my hand. "Welcome to Calix Insight. I'm Renee Ellis. I'll be conducting the final portion of your interview today." The handshake was weak, her fingers cold. She didn't say anything at first. When she did, it was barely a whisper. "You're Ellis." I nodded once, then gestured toward the hallway. "Follow me, please." We walked in silence to the main conference room. She avoided eye contact. Her pace slowed slightly, like she was stalling for breath she couldn't find. Inside the room, the others were already seated, No one acknowledged the shift in energy, though I knew they felt it. We started with the usual introductions. Emily's voice was tight but steady. She began answering questions, leaning on polished phrases and memorized metrics, but I could tell her rhythm was fractured. When Raj asked about her experience implementing data equity frameworks, she stumbled. When Veronica asked her to walk through a compliance scenario, she hesitated before giving an answer that lacked clarity. She smiled too often, nodding like she was still trying to win a dinner party instead of a leadership role. By the time Sophia began the behavioral section, Emily's voice had lost its confidence. Her story about overcoming internal team conflict was vague. Her response to questions about humility and accountability felt rehearsed. She looked over at me once, maybe searching for an anchor, but I kept my face neutral. I wasn't going to save her from the discomfort of being seen truthfully for the first time. When the panel excused themselves, I remained seated. She didn't move. "I didn't know," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the table. "You never told anyone." I waited, letting the silence stretch. "Why would you?" I asked finally, voice steady. No one ever asked. She looked at me then, really looked, but all those years. At holidays, you let them talk to you like you were still lost. I nodded. Because their definition of success never matched mine, and I stopped needing them to approve it. There was no satisfaction in saying that, only clarity. She sat back slowly, hands folded over her lap, and for the first time in years. Emily looked unsure of who she was. The mask she had worn for so long was beginning to slip, not from exposure, but from exhaustion. She had spent a decade trying to win a game that no longer served her, only to walk into a room built by someone she had underestimated her entire life. Emily sat across from me, no longer the composed professional she'd been when she walked through the door. Her voice was quieter now, her words less curated. "I just don't understand how you did all this without anyone knowing," she said, still scanning the room like she expected the walls to give her context she could control. I didn't answer right away because I knew what she was really asking wasn't about logistics. She was asking how I kept working while they kept talking, how I kept showing up without being seen, how I survived the weight of being underestimated by people who were supposed to believe in me first. When I finally spoke, I didn't say anything dramatic. I just told her the truth. I wasn't hiding. I was building, and you weren't looking. She blinked like she'd been slapped. It wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. For the first time in years, I saw her shoulders drop, her posture collapse slightly, like she'd finally stopped trying to uphold something she didn't even believe in anymore. "I always thought you'd given up," she admitted. Voice rough. The way Mom and Dad talked about you, the way they'd change the subject or say you were figuring things out. I didn't think you were doing anything serious. I didn't know how wrong I was. I could have said something sharp in return. I could have reminded her of all the times she corrected me in front of people, all the times she spoke for me when no one asked her to. But I didn't, because the person sitting across from me wasn't that version of her anymore. She looked stripped of performance and strangely human. Her eyes were red at the edges, not from crying, but from holding in too much for too long. "You weren't the only one carrying something," she said suddenly. "Do you know what it's like to always win and never be allowed to quit every time I succeeded?" The bar moved higher. Harvard wasn't enough. Then it was partner track. Then it was international exposure. Every time I delivered, it was treated like the minimum. She looked away when she said it, like shame still lingered even though no one else was in the room. I stayed quiet, letting her speak. because I knew that feeling, not the specific version she lived, but the fatigue that comes from living a life for someone else's scoreboard. By the time I hit 34, she continued, I realized I didn't even know what I liked anymore. I was just performing competence. And when I saw the role at Calix, something about it felt different, not just prestigious, meaningful. I watched her for a moment before responding. Then why exaggerate on your resume? She flinched but didn't deny it. Because I didn't think I'd be enough on my own, she whispered. Because I thought I had to outshine, not just show up. And because I've never actually been in a room where merit mattered more than connections. I assumed this would be the same. Her honesty didn't absolve her, but it explained her. I understood now why her confidence had cracked so fast in the interview. She hadn't just walked into a job opportunity. She had walked into the first honest mirror she'd faced in years. I leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch again. It didn't feel tense. It felt earned. I didn't bring you here to embarrass you, I said, and I'm not going to pretend this situation isn't complicated. But here's what I care about. At Calix, we don't hire based on who you used to impress. We hire based on who you're becoming. If you want this role, you'll have to reapply. Honestly, this time, clean resume, no embellishments. And you'll go through the process again like everyone else. She nodded slowly, the weight of that reality settling in. And if I don't, she asked. Then we both move on, I replied. And you find something that fits better. But either way, the pretending ends here. She exhaled deeply, something between a laugh and a sob escaping her throat. Then she nodded again, more solidly this time. Fair, she said, more than fair, and for the first time in a decade. I believed we might finally be speaking the same language. That evening, for the first time in years, Emily and I arrived at our parents' home together. We didn't plan it that way. She had asked, tentatively, if we could share a ride. I agreed without overthinking it. The car ride was mostly quiet, filled with that delicate kind of silence that doesn't demand to be broken. I could tell she was still processing what had happened in the interview room. Her voice, usually quick and confident, stayed tucked away like something still drying from rain. The house looked exactly as it always had, pristine and over-prepared. My mother answered the door in her usual cardigan and pearls, her expression briefly startled at seeing the two of us together. Her eyes flicked from my professional attire to Emily's subdued face, as if trying to solve an equation she wasn't expecting. I didn't realize you'd be coming too, she said carefully, directing her words at me, but watching my sister. Emily just said she had something to discuss. I stepped inside without answering. The hallway still smelled like lemon polish and control. Our father sat in the dining room already, glasses perched low on his nose as he reviewed papers that probably had nothing to do with work, but everything to do with appearing occupied. He looked up when we entered, his brows lifting slightly at the sight of both daughters. Is everything all right? He asked, which in our family always translated to, has someone failed in a way I can fix before either of us could respond? Emily spoke. Her voice was steady, but lower than usual. We need to talk about something, and I need you both to listen. She didn't wait for permission. She walked to the head of the table and placed her purse down like a shield. My interview today didn't go as expected. She said, I discovered something I wasn't prepared for. Our mother leaned in, confusion creeping across her face. Was it canceled? Did they change the role? Emily glanced at me, then exhaled. No. I found out that the company I applied to, Calix Insight, was founded by Renee. The silence that followed was so complete. I could hear the clock ticking in the living room. Our mother blinked, Once, twice. I thought the founder's name was Renee Ellis. She reached for her phone, fingers already typing. My father frowned, already skeptical. That doesn't make sense. You've never mentioned this. I didn't flinch, because I didn't need to. I started the company 7 years ago under a different name. I never hid it. You just never asked. My mother stared at her screen, then looked up slowly. You're in Forbes. There's a profile. I don't understand. I nodded calmly. That profile came out last year. We've grown steadily. Over 200 clients now. Full-time staff across 3 cities. My father set his papers down and folded his hands. Why didn't you ever tell us? Why would you let us believe you were struggling? I looked at him and spoke plainly. Because every time I tried to share something that didn't fit your version of success, you minimized it. Eventually, I stopped offering anything at all. His face tightened, not in anger, but in the slow recognition of something he had missed entirely. My mother glanced at Emily, then back at me. But you've done something incredible. This is what we always hoped you'd become. I smiled faintly. No, you hoped I'd become something you could understand. I became something you never bothered to see. Emily cleared her throat, her voice trembling slightly. There's more. I wasn't honest on my resume. I overstated things because I didn't think who I am was good enough. And that's on me. The confession hung in the air like static. Our father looked startled, as if vulnerability had knocked on the wrong door. You don't need to confess anything. You're doing fine, he said reflexively. Emily shook her head. I'm tired of pretending. I've spent years performing success. I want to find something real. The room shifted. Something cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of a door unlocking. For a long time, no one spoke. My mother reached for the serving tray with shaking hands, her eyes still full of calculation and doubt. My father leaned back, as if the chair could hold the weight of everything he hadn't seen, and I, for once, didn't feel like the one who had to explain herself. I had built something that didn't need defending. The weeks that followed that dinner didn't bring any grand gestures or apologies wrapped in ribbons. But something shifted, quietly at first. Then, with more weight as time passed, my mother started forwarding me articles about nonprofit data impact, asking simple questions I never expected from her. What does machine-readable compliance actually mean in your field, she asked once. Genuinely curious, not just performing interest. I gave her a clear answer without simplifying it to make her feel better. She didn't flinch. She just listened. My father, who had built his entire identity around control and planning, responded in his own language. 2 weeks after that night, I found a box at my office reception. Inside was a hardcover book on education equity and a handwritten note that read, I'm reading now, so I can finally catch up. I hadn't seen his handwriting on anything other than checks or reminders in decades. He didn't call. He didn't try to over-explain. But that gesture told me he had begun to let go of the version of me he had always wanted and was finally starting to meet the version that existed. Emily and I kept our distance for a little while, both needing time to process what had happened. But about a month later, she asked to meet for coffee, not at the usual family brunch place with overpriced eggs and stiff napkins, but at a small cafe near Calyx, the kind I had gone to for years while no one noticed. She looked different, still polished, still composed, but softer around the edges, like someone who had finally exhaled after holding their breath for too long. I didn't reapply, she said, no shame in her voice. It wouldn't have been fair. I wasn't ready, and we both know it. I respected her for that. I had built Calyx on honesty, and she had finally shown me hers. But what she said next surprised me. I've been thinking about education access, about policy work that doesn't require selling yourself in a boardroom every week. I'm not sure where I belong yet, but for the first time in years, I'm asking what I actually care about instead of what looks impressive. I looked at her then and saw not the sister who once overshadowed me, but a woman finally taking off a heavy costume. We began meeting once a week. Sometimes we talked about her next steps. Other times we didn't talk about work at all. We just sat. Two people who had once been divided by comparisons neither of us had asked for. Now, trying to rebuild something grounded in reality. I showed her how we tracked impact metrics without over-polishing the numbers. She showed me how policy thinking could shape systems upstream. We challenged each other in ways that felt less like combat and more like construction. My parents didn't change overnight, but their behavior started to bend in new directions. When a cousin announced a promotion, my mother paused before launching into a monologue. Instead, she asked how the work made her feel. That small shift told me more than any apology could. At the next family gathering, someone brought up the old comparison game again. So now both Porter sisters are changing the world, an uncle joked. But before I could respond, my father stepped in, surprisingly steady. We're learning to ask better questions than that now, he said. The conversation moved on. Success, I had learned, was never supposed to be a performance. It was supposed to be a process. And for the first time, it felt like the people around me were beginning to understand that too. Emily still wasn't sure what came next, but she had enrolled in a course on education funding and started volunteering with a local after-school program. I watched her light up when she talked about actual kids, not campaigns or optics. It was a kind of pride that didn't rely on praise, and I recognized it instantly. At Calyx, we continued expanding. I kept my head down and my standards high, but I made space now, not just for results, but for real conversations. I added a new section to our onboarding program focused on ethical storytelling because I had seen firsthand what happened when people became addicted to image over integrity. I stopped avoiding family events too, not because they had changed completely, but because I no longer walked into them needing to be understood. I already knew who I was. 6 months after the interview, the energy in my life had shifted in ways that couldn't be captured in a single conversation. I wasn't attending more events or chasing visibility. In fact, I turned down a keynote invitation at a national conference just because it fell on the same day as Emily's first public talk for a local education nonprofit. It wasn't a major venue, just a small community center downtown, but she had invited me without any performance in her tone. She simply said, "I think I want you there," and that was enough. Watching her that day, standing in front of 30 folding chairs and a budget projector, I saw a different kind of pride on her face. It wasn't the polished kind she used to wear like armor. It was quieter, more grounded. She wasn't trying to prove she was impressive. She was trying to be useful. Her presentation was about funding access and digital inequality in rural schools. She didn't quote any glossy reports or name-drop international partners. Instead, she told the story of a 6th grader who had never owned a device with a keyboard and how that impacted learning. I listened as the room leaned in, not because she was perfect, but because she was present. That kind of leadership doesn't get you trophies, but it changes things. Afterward, over paper cups of weak coffee, she asked if I thought she was on the right track. I told her the truth. You're building something honest. That matters more than anything I could say. She nodded, and this time, didn't follow it with a disclaimer or self-deprecating joke. She just sat with the compliment and let it land. For someone like Emily, who had been raised to only value praise when it came with ranking, that was growth. At Calix, things continued to expand, but I found myself redefining what growth meant, instead of focusing on our valuation or client count. I began tracking retention among our entry-level staff, asking how safe they felt to speak honestly in meetings. We added new partnerships with smaller school districts that couldn't afford the big contracts but needed the insights more urgently than most. I started hosting quarterly forums, not for press, but for idea exchange, and Emily came to one as a participant, not a guest of honor. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did contribute, it was thoughtful and specific. I saw a few junior analysts nod during her remarks. That meant more to me than any article she used to write. My relationship with our parents also began shifting, not through grand apologies, but through consistent, smaller moments. My father, who once measured worth by titles and credentials, sent me a spreadsheet he had made comparing nonprofit impact tools, trying to understand your world. The subject line read, "My mother began asking about hiring ethics and how to support organizations that weren't built around legacy networks." One Sunday, without prompting, she said, "We were wrong about a lot of things, weren't we?" I didn't rush to answer. Sometimes acknowledgement is enough, and sometimes silence is its own reply. For the first time, I saw my success not as something to protect from my family, but as something that could soften them. Not to prove I was right, but to help them evolve. That was never the goal in the beginning, but perhaps it was the most powerful outcome. I stopped defining my wins by the size of the recognition and started measuring by the depth of alignment. Was I still working from clarity? Was I still choosing impact over performance? Was I still leading in a way that left room for others to grow? I didn't start Calix to get even. I started it because no one else was solving the problem I couldn't stop seeing. But somehow, through the process of building something real, I had also built a space for healing, not just for me, but for people around me who were also tired of pretending. And maybe that's the quiet legacy of anyone who refuses to play by the rules of toxic ambition. You don't just break patterns, you rewrite them. The greatest change, I've learned, doesn't usually happen in boardrooms or viral speeches. It happens when no one's watching. It settles in slowly, like the quiet after a storm, when you realize the roof held after all, and maybe that matters more than the weather. 6 months after everything unfolded, I was walking through the Calix office one evening, lights dimmed, most desks empty, and it struck me how different the air felt. Not because the company had grown, though it had, not because the metrics were strong, though they were. It was the absence of fear, the kind that used to hum beneath every decision. Back when I was still trying to prove something to people who had never truly seen me. I no longer walked into rooms bracing for doubt, not because the world had changed, but because my posture had. I had built a company where integrity was more than a tagline. We didn't reward noise. We rewarded clarity. And the people who stayed understood that. We lost a few along the way, of course. People who preferred spotlight over substance rarely last long here, but what remained felt solid. like something worth protecting without ever needing to pretend. Emily, by now, had started a small policy research unit embedded within a nonprofit coalition. She wasn't the executive or the face of it. She was the strategist behind the scenes, building frameworks to help public schools track equity data without hiring overpriced consultants. She invited me to review her draft report last week. It was thoughtful, rigorous, and not built for attention. That was the part that made me proud. Not that it had my influence, but that it didn't need to. We met for dinner afterward. Nothing fancy. Just a small Thai place we used to pass as teenagers, but never stepped into. She asked if I missed being underestimated. I laughed. You only miss that if you needed it to feel powerful. I told her, I used to think being the underdog gave me an edge, but it also kept me attached to their game. She nodded like she understood, and I think she finally did. That success wasn't the opposite of failure. It was the absence of comparison. At the next family gathering, something unusual happened. There was no formal announcement, no glass-clinking introduction, just a quiet shift in tone. My uncle, who used to open every conversation with career status checks, asked what books I was reading instead. My mother handed me a folder of articles she'd clipped, all about community data transparency, and said, I think you'd have thoughts on these. She didn't praise. She didn't correct. She invited. My father sat next to me during dinner, listened while I spoke, and said only one sentence that stayed with me long after dessert. You made something real. That's all I ever wanted. Not applause, not recognition, just space to build what didn't exist, and the freedom to define what mattered without defending it every time, and for the first time. I felt like my family could finally sit in the same room with me and not rewrite my story in real time. We weren't healed entirely, but we were honest. That was enough. I created a small internal program at Calix called Quiet Founders. It's not a public-facing initiative. No press, no branding, just a quarterly session where team members can bring in people from their lives who had built something meaningful outside the spotlight. We sit in a room, drink strong coffee, and listen. Last session, one woman brought her grandmother, who had run an unofficial shelter in her basement for women leaving abusive homes. No website, no funding, just a deep sense of purpose. Another brought a neighbor who had created a community garden that fed 2 entire blocks during lockdown. Real leadership often has no LinkedIn profile. It just leaves evidence in people's lives. That's what I want more of now. Less spectacle, more substance. I'm no longer interested in success as a trophy. I'm interested in success as a tool, something you use to build, to shelter, to correct, to heal, something that doesn't serve your ego, but serves a need. I don't walk into rooms expecting to be the most impressive person there. I walk in hoping I won't be the only one who's done the hard, invisible work. I used to think the story ended when they finally saw me, but now I know the real ending was when I stopped needing them to. 1 year after that barbecue, I stood in the same backyard, but this time there was no tension in my chest. The tablecloths were still perfectly ironed, the napkins still folded like museum exhibits, and my father still manned the grill like it was a battlefield. But something was different. The air didn't hum with the weight of unspoken expectations. The conversation wasn't a scoreboard. No one asked who got promoted or which firm had the highest valuation. People asked about community projects, about impact, about time. That was new. Emily and I arrived together again, not as a statement, just because it felt natural. She brought a short stack of printed reports from the nonprofit she was now helping lead. Not to show off, just because someone had asked in advance. When our mother introduced her, she didn't mention titles or Ivy League schools. She said, "Emily's been working on a project that helps schools with limited funding track equity across different student groups. It's making a difference." And that was it. No padding, no pageantry, just truth. For a long time, I thought I would only feel whole if they finally saw me, that I'd need a public acknowledgement, or maybe an apology with eye contact and full sentences. But it didn't happen like that. What came instead was softer. My father refilling my glass before I asked. My mother quietly asking what I'd need if I were to expand Calyx into rural districts. No spotlight, just presence. And that, somehow, meant more. After dinner, while everyone lingered in conversation or wandered toward dessert, my Uncle James pulled me aside. He was the one who used to call me the one still figuring it out, often with a smirk and a sideways glance. But this time, his voice was different. I didn't get it. He said, "Not making excuses. I thought success looked a certain way. I see now that I had no idea what I was talking about. I didn't offer comfort. I just nodded. Sometimes growth sounds like admission, not applause." That night, as I walked past the patio lights and down the garden path toward the gate, I paused by the fountain, same spot where I had stood exactly a year ago, holding a plate I didn't want and listening to a family that didn't really see me. It felt like another lifetime. I thought about how far I had come, not in terms of distance, but in direction. I had built a life on my terms, and eventually the people who mattered either adjusted or drifted, and I stopped chasing the ones who couldn't learn to see me without needing me to shrink. Calyx was entering its 8th year. We had just hired our 100th team member. Our retention rate was higher than ever, and more than half of our clients had come through referrals, not campaigns. I had finally opened a West Coast satellite office, not because of pressure, but because the need was real. We were working with state education boards now, not just individual schools, but I still sat in on staff trainings, still reviewed the mission statement quarterly, still believed that quiet work was more durable than flashy noise. I no longer carried the need to impress. I carried clarity, and that freed me to lead in a way I hadn't before. There were no fantasies of revenge, no hunger to one-up anyone, just the grounded satisfaction of knowing I had chosen the right battles, even when no one else understood them. As I stood there near the fountain, Emily joined me, holding 2 small plates of mango tart. She didn't speak right away. She just handed me one and looked out into the backyard, where our parents laughed with neighbors, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Then she said, "Do you ever think about what might have happened if they had seen us clearly from the start?" I didn't hesitate. "No, because then we wouldn't have had to find ourselves on our own." She smiled, not the polished one, but the one I hadn't seen since we were teenagers, hiding from expectations we didn't have words for. We stood there, eating slowly, not needing to fill the silence. And that's when I knew the story wasn't about redemption or proving anyone wrong. It was about choosing peace over performance, depth over display. So if you're listening to this wondering whether it's worth it to keep going without applause, to build quietly when no one's cheering, to stay honest even when the world favors polish, I'll say this: there is a kind of power in becoming the version of yourself you no longer have to explain. Have you ever grown into a life that your old world couldn't understand? What did you choose to keep, and what did you learn to let go of?